So earlier this year, millions of Americans celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. Central to this historic mission was this woman. How many of you know this woman? Katherine Johnson, right? She and a group of African American scientists, mathematicians, and engineers were the focus of the best-selling novel and movie, Hidden Figures. So if you know a little bit about the story, you know that Katherine and her colleagues lived and worked at a time where they underwent persistent challenges to their work identity. From questions about their credentials, challenges to their success, or just overt barriers to their career aspirations. Well, let's be clear, those were motivated by sexist and racist attitudes and behaviors. But as I learned more about Katherine and her colleagues, I began to wonder and really worry if any of them internalize those messages. You know, those messages that tell yourself that somehow you didn't earn your success or your accomplishments, somehow that you don't belong here, somehow that maybe, just maybe, you're an imposter. Do you know those feelings? Have you told yourself that? Because I have, and it almost lost me the career that I'd spent over a decade preparing for. My name is Holly Hutchins. I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, and today I want to share a little bit with you about my research on how to debunk the work imposter. So what is the work imposter, or imposter phenomena? Around the time Katherine and her colleagues were working at NASA Langley, two psychologists by the name of Suzanne Imes and Peggy Clance were doing some really interesting work with a group of highly successful women. These women were educated, credentialed, they had a lot of successes, but they were having a difficult time internalizing those successes. They would either discount them, they'd say that, well, I was just lucky or in the right place at the right time, and this was causing a lot of psychological distress for them. Well, I know that. I've definitely experienced that. And so fast forward to 2004, and there had been a lot of discussion about the imposter, but definitely in the last 5 years, it started to really take shape. So in 2004, right after I finished my PhD, I accepted a position with a prestigious university. And what should have been a wonderful start to a career that I spent, again, over a decade preparing for, here were the words and phrases circulating in my head. It was a really dark time for me. I walked around the first 2 years of my career feeling like a fraud, feeling like an intellectual inadequate, and saying these things to myself. When is someone going to find out that I really don't know what I'm talking about? That I'm really not the expert that they think I am? And oh my gosh, when will I be exposed? I'm wondering if any of you have ever felt like that in your own experience. So I got help. I finally got counseling and was able to make my way back. But in the midst of that, I realized, wait a minute, I'm a researcher, and I ask questions. And often, the best research comes out of the lived experience. And so I began asking questions of a couple of my colleagues, actually 315 to be exact. And I launched a study, and I began publishing and talking and interacting with my colleagues who, guess what, were having some of the same experiences. And so I want to share with you some of the findings from that research and what has not only helped me, but helped others, and then helped me again. So the good news or the bad news? What do you want first? Oh, bad news. Okay. So I was hoping you'd say good news. So the bad news is that if you've experienced feeling or thinking like an imposter, you're probably going to feel it again. Okay? But the good news about that is that you're not alone. You see, part of what kept me silenced and really so fearful the last couple of years, or the first couple of years of my career, was that I felt like I was the only one. And so when we suffer in silence or suffer in shame, it becomes almost unbearable. So the good news is that because everyone has it, it's fairly normal. And the way that we position this in our research is that it's part of a normal career experience of developing your identity. And so you're likely to have it multiple times. Now, you've probably heard celebrities talk about it, professionals, and everyone in between about that. So it's something that's definitely becoming more normalized within our lexicon. But competent professionals will experience this at some point. Now, the actual definition of an imposter is that you have experienced success, whatever that means for you, you have accomplishments, and that you're competent. But you're not telling yourself that story. In fact, you're telling yourself an alternative story that's just really not true. So one of the things that we discovered in our research were there were fairly 4 predictable triggers for when the imposter would come visit you. One, oddly, maybe not, around successes. I'll never forget sitting across the table from a colleague that I know very well. He's an expert in his field. And he would say every time he got a call to do a media interview or sit on a panel, he would somehow find a way to get out of it. Why? Because he didn't see himself as an expert. Interestingly, also around failures, a lot of times that's where we learn the most, around when we misstep or have failures. That's part of learning and part of growing as an individual. But I'll never forget a colleague also talking about a time where he didn't know the answer to a student question. He went home and he worked incessantly over the weekends, pulling an all-nighter so he'd be prepared for that question on Monday. Well, guess what? There'll be a different question at that point. Around work challenges, work opportunities, new opportunities, we were finding that individuals that really struggled with thinking and feeling like an imposter were opting out of those, opting out of opportunities to display their greatness. The good thing about identifying these is that we can predict these. And when we can predict, we can plan for these. So that's the bad news, good news, and then some more good news. So the second thing that we found was around coping. People really don't cope with feeling and thinking like an imposter. In fact, when I was going through the most difficult part of my career, and I would lie to you if I told you that I didn't still experience it. In fact, a self-proclaimed imposter giving a TED Talk, right? I mean, how ironic is that? That's what we're all talking about in getting ready for this in the backstage, is that people don't cope very well because they feel like they're the only one. And when you don't cope very well, guess what? It shows up in your work performance. It shows up in your life. And so in our study, we were the first ones to actually link it to work outcomes. And we found individuals that were feeling and thinking like an imposter were less satisfied at work. They were reporting higher levels of burnout, and they were opting out of career opportunities. So they were reporting low career striving. So this is something that I talk about a lot in terms of experiences of an imposter. And when we talk about some of the coping, more the positive coping, we actually found it didn't matter. This only provided temporary relief. So even individuals that were engaging in social support, reflecting on their successes, and I would say there were a few of those, still found that it really didn't get to the root cause. And the work outcomes would get worse and worse and worse. So when I'd speak about this, and I'd do interviews about this, people would say, okay, that's really great. That's me, yeah, but what are you going to do about it? I mean, what good is research if you really don't help people? And people were asking for that help immediately. And so that really caused me to pause on, so what kind of help can we give? And it wasn't until I discovered an approach that had been used with success with veterans suffering from PTSD that I found my answer. It's called cognitive processing therapy. You've probably heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. That's the connection between thoughts and behaviors. But this really focuses on the story that we tell ourselves about who we are and our worth. And this provided the light for me and countless others in understanding how to turn that story around. So we designed a workshop. We took the 12 steps of a CPT clinical approach and took that to actually a work setting. We pared it down to a couple of hours and 4 steps, and I want to share with you what those 4 steps are and some of the surprising outcomes that we found with this. But the essence of this is don't believe everything you think. And that's really powerful. Don't believe everything you think. So we have people come in, and our first major work around this was with academic faculty. And so we had them come in and say, and tell us a story. Tell us a story of when you've thought or felt like an imposter. And they would come in and they would tell us about the people and the context, but we really wanted them to talk to us more about the story that they're telling themselves. You know, what does it mean about who they are? What are they telling themselves about who they are? As we heard those stories, we were able to identify stuck points. Stuck points are really old stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and they're dusty records. In those of you that can remember playing records, right? It's like having the record skip. These are old stories that we tell ourselves, maybe hearkening back for decades, about who we are and why we're not successful or accomplished or whatnot. When we were able to identify those stuck points, we could figure out why that imposter was becoming so ingrained in their memory. The third point, challenging distorted thoughts. You know, the stuck points typically took a form of if-then. If I was a better professor, I wouldn't have students question me. If I was a better researcher, I would have gotten that grant. If I was a better academic, I would have gotten that interview. And so when we identify those if-then statements, we then taught individuals to challenge those distorted thoughts. Is that all the story or part of the story? What's the evidence for or against that stuck point? As we did this, individuals were able to separate themselves from those stuck points and begin to understand that's just a story. It's not me. The last thing we would do is have them tell us that story again. You know, our reality is a story, right? And when they were able to separate themselves, see the story that they were telling themselves, they were able to understand and open up to alternative explanations, to challenge that fake news story they'd been telling themselves for so long. So what were some of the results? 3 months after we ran the workshop, we bring people back and we have them do another set of surveys, and then we talk with them in focus groups. We found that those individuals actually reported lower levels of imposter cognitions, statistically significant lower levels, and higher levels of core self-evaluation, you know, the way in which they assess their worth and capability. But the most powerful part was what we heard. I heard colleagues talk about stopping that train wreck that was prohibiting them from moving forward in their work, a book chapter, a media interview, a grant. People were separating themselves from their paranoia or their anxiety. And finally, they didn't feel alone. These are some of the most powerful stories that I heard. And in hearing those stories, it not only, you know, verified my work, but it also healed me a little bit. Actually, it healed me a lot because I'd found my community now. I wasn't alone. So what if your imposter is just a series of thinking errors that can be challenged and can be reframed? What I'd like to leave you with today is, what are some of the new frontiers you are missing by limiting yourself, by telling yourself a very old story? I don't know about you, but I bet the Apollo 11 astronauts were really glad that Katherine and her colleagues didn't internalize those messages, didn't opt out, because, you know, Katherine and her colleagues were the reason they got back safely to Earth. Thank you very much.